This is The Wealth Puzzle with Michael Mansfield from the Lynn Group. When a part of your financial strategy is out of tune, your long-term goals, your retirement savings, and your legacy can all suffer. With many years of experience in the financial industry, Michael provides his clients and prospects with the information they need regarding Social Security, retirement income planning, wealth management, and much more. Listen in as we address your financial concerns and provide helpful solutions to put you on the path to achieving your retirement goals. And now, here is The Wealth Puzzle with Michael Mansfield.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. This is Mike Mansfield. It is bright and early. What is it? It's just past 4 a.m. Tuesday, March 25th. I just jogged over to the old office here to get down to business, but certainly wanted to make a video. It's been a couple weeks. I was waiting to get through the Federal Reserve meeting last week and get a couple of headlines cleared. And so if you go back and watch the last couple of videos, the things that I was talking about is what is the driver of the stock market? The stock market started going down from its all-time high somewhere around February 19th. Peak to trough, the S&P 500 went down about 10%. And I started getting a lot of phone calls. And they were interesting phone calls because as I talked to people about the idea of corrections, and this is healthy, I pointed out last July how the market itself fell almost 10% and it cycled back up, and people don't even remember that. I then looked back over the last decade and saw there's probably 11 or 12, 10% plus corrections. So they happen very regularly in the market. And as I had those general conversations with people, I was constantly reminded that this time is different. And it's hard to understand what that really means. So what's happening right now, and what I discussed certainly in my last video, is the market's being driven by headlines, right? It's being driven by kind of some anxiety and some fears. The concern of tariffs, it was the government shutdown, it was negative GDP, geopolitical conflicts. And even since my last video, what's happened? All of the sudden, the shutdown was a nothing burger and the market went back up. All of the sudden, the tariff conversation has evolved even further, and maybe it's not as terrifying as people think. I'm sure it's still problematic. We still need to get through April 2nd. So that headline is certainly not past us. We're all living in the dark on what the reality of it is, but maybe it's not as painful as we thought. One of the things I also highlighted was with our GDP, our negative gross domestic product for the first quarter. When I made my last video, it was negative 2.8%. It has now been revised for the first quarter to 1.8%. So that number has actually been softening. What I had highlighted is I was, we'll say, curious about the GDP number because the biggest offset in calculating GDP for a quarter is imports. And so when people were concerned and confused about tariffs, there has been large inventory building, importing activity by companies, corporations, and businesses in the United States, which intentionally creates a pretty large drag on GDP. So when the data comes out here in a few weeks, we're going to learn very quickly is this negative GDP solely a catalyst of consumer spending declining, which is very problematic for the US? Or is it a trade imbalance at the moment that is something that can be normalized, just like we saw during COVID when we had supply chain issues? So there's a lot going on there. But at the moment, the good news is the market has certainly stabilized. It's kind of ironically doing run of the mill at the moment. It isn't certainly playing to this time is different just yet. And so we're going to watch that and we'll keep an eye on it. And obviously we're going to keep you guys abreast. The quarter ends here in about a week. And then, oh my gosh, then we have a whole new set of chaos, right? Earnings start coming out in April. And remember, there's three major drivers to the market. It's the earnings. Earnings have been stable this year. So that hasn't been a catalyst for downside movement of any significance, right? What's the Fed going to do? And then what is old Congress going to do when it comes to tax policies and things of that nature? Those are the headwinds or tailwinds. Last week, the Federal Reserve met and then they had their public meeting. And honestly, it was kind of dour. If you go watch the federal presentation and you go read the quarterly report they put out, the SEP, the Summary of Economic Projections, we saw that the Federal Reserve feels there's going to be no progress made on inflation this year. They feel that the labor market is going to soften. And so as they're going through those data points last Wednesday, I'm kind of sitting here watching on the news going, this doesn't sound that climactic with their projections. And then they get to the only part that people care about. And they said, yeah, but it looks like we're still committed to doing 2 rate cuts this year. See, we as a society are addicted to our cheap money. We want our cheap mortgages. We want our cheap car loans. We want cheap, 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 cheap. And so the trajectory of the Federal Reserve continuing to cut interest rates over the next 2 years is a tailwind to the market. It is bullish. And so that day, the market did certainly cycle up nicely. I think the Dow was up 400 points that day when Powell was done talking. And it's funny because if you looked at the economic data, you'd be like, I don't know that that was any good news. But the news that people gleaned out of it is the Feds haven't pulled back any further from the idea of doing rate cuts later this year. And so that's what people are hanging their hats on. So the market is the market. It's obviously impulsive. If I was to give any kind of clarity to where the market's at so far this year, the Dow Jones is a whopping flat, right? Remember, this is the worst correction we can all seem to remember all of a sudden. The Dow is flat this year, and the S&P is currently down 1.7% year to date. So pretty boring at the moment. But in any case, kind of moving on. So I wanted to touch on some things. Over the last 3 weeks, I have fielded at least a dozen phone calls, text messages, in-office meetings that have had some very strong relevance around the idea that the current administration is getting rid of Social Security. This is completely inaccurate. I have no idea where this giant rumor is coming from because it is spread thick everywhere. And so, I in a meeting last week, I kind of turned to a resource that I don't really like. I went to ChatGPT. I have found this program, I dabble with it once in a while. I have found it to be surprisingly inaccurate when you're asking for like anything detailed. Like I was working on a spreadsheet and I wanted to test a calculation I was doing on some tax thing. And I asked ChatGPT, hey, take this data and crunch it for me. And it came up with something that was completely wrong. And I saw the error and I called it out. I said, but that's not how you calculate that Social Security payroll tax withholding. It's based on this. And the program literally said, whoops, you're correct. Let me redo the math for you. So that was a little terrifying. So I don't know how much credence I give this, but I think what I've learned about ChatGPT is what it can really do for you is, in the old days when you type something into the search bar in Google and it gives all the websites, and now you're clicking on each website looking for that piece of information that you want. That's all it's really doing for you is it's fast tracking, looking at a bunch of websites. And so I typed in here, give quotes of Trump saying he wants to get rid of Social Security. And, I knew that if they were out there, it was going to find them and pull them out. And so it shows me PolitiFact and Snopes and On the Issues and so all these different websites. Here's an old statement from Trump a number of years ago. Social Security is here to stay. To be sure, we must reform it, root out the fraud, make it more efficient, and ensure the program is solvent. All right, fair enough. I mean, here's another quote. We are going to save your Social Security and we're going to save your Medicare. And then in the bottom paragraph, ChatGPT decided to summarize what the internet has said when looking for quotes from Trump. Even though it's important to note that while Trump has made statements around altering the funding mechanisms of Social Security, he has also consistently emphasized his intent to preserve the program and protect the beneficiaries. So, it's everyone's dealing with this urban legend, and I realize it's overwhelming and scary because, I pay into Social Security. It's in my cash flow plan. I've built it out for my family. I even have it mapped out that if I got hit by a car tomorrow, how much money could my wife go get for all of our dependent children? And I've built that all out for her. So I'm relying on it mentally as a safety net. So trust me, I don't want it going anywhere. I think one of the things that maybe is the driver of that is the idea that they're closing Social Security offices. So since Trump has become president, they have announced 47 offices are to be closed, of which 26 are being closed this year. And so I went to the Associated Press. They had a list of all of those offices. It's kind of funny. There's not even one being closed in California, but it's kind of like one every other state kind of a thing. And so guess what they're rooting out? They're rooting out the offices that have low occupancy, low use. These are the offices that are just inefficient. They're not, because remember, think about it locally. We got one in Ventura, we got one in Oxnard, we got one in Thousand Oaks. They're all over the place. So they're closing 26 offices this year. Guess what? There's over 1,200 offices in the United States. So that's kind of a nothing burger. They're just trying to cut off the ones that don't seem to be useful. So this isn't exactly a huge push towards getting rid of the opportunity to be able to go to a Social Security office. Like I said, even us California Lokies here, there's no impact certainly to the offices that we're utilizing. So, obviously I know that, some people are going to agree with this information, some people aren't, but I'm just trying to put the data out there on the way that we're seeing it and perceiving it. One of the things though that has certainly been, I don't know, kind of weighing on me, and as clients come into the office, I oftentimes pull up the US Debt Clock website, and I oftentimes talk about Federal Reserve policy and the trajectory of interest rates and how the national debt is impacted by the interest rates and all of that. And what we know at the moment is we're spending $3 billion a day in the United States on interest. That's almost $1.1 trillion of interest this year on our giant country's credit card. That's very, very problematic. We're still on pace to have over a $2 trillion deficit this year. We have some very serious fiscal issues in this country. I mean, even if you take it to a microcosm, California just asked the federal government for over $6 billion to make Medi-Cal solvent again, because we basically bankrupt Medicaid over the last Medi-Cal, you get all the terminology off, over the last couple of years, because we actually didn't follow federal laws on who is eligible and kind of did our own thing. But, we're all dealing with these giant debt issues. And so Ray Dalio, he runs one of the world's largest hedge funds. He's a very serious dude. And he kind of called out the Trump administration and said, hey, you guys better do something. And I thought his analysis was very appropriate. What he was talking about is, in his calculations, if we don't reduce our budget deficit, so that's the $2 trillion we're spending, from 7.5% of our GDP. So remember, our GDP is this green number on the right, $30 trillion, but we're spending 2, so about 7%. If we don't reduce that pretty immediately from 7% to 3%, we're in what he was defining as how did he say it? He had such better terminology than me. A debt death spiral. A little scary sounding, but he's not wrong, because what he was talking about is he's referencing to private industries. This is how businesses go out of business: is they take on too much debt, then the service of the debt goes up, and so the more you spend on the service of the debt ultimately collapses the business. And that's the trajectory that this country is on if we don't get our spending under control. And so this is something that, I'm certainly watching. It's something that I put a lot of thought and curiosity into. Because our debt to GDP ratio is really high, our spending is really high. These are all things that need to be addressed. And unfortunately, we've reached a point in the math that this isn't a revenue issue. This isn't a taxation issue. This is a spending issue. So in any case, hope this was informative. I'll certainly be back next week. I'm going to run home in a little bit and get dressed for the work day, and I'll be back. So hope everybody has a great day. I hope everyone appreciates the information. If you have any questions, just call me. If you'd like to talk about stuff, that's why we're here. I understand the emotions. I understand how overwhelming a lot of this stuff can be. We're all living it in different ways. And so just reach out, 805-500-7035. I'd be more than happy to talk to you, shoot the breeze with you. Certainly give you my 2 cents. So in any case, I hope everyone has a great day.